Hello, welcome to the Agile Matrix Podcast, where we break down agile principles, practices, and challenges to help you build better teams and products. So I'm your host again, ever excited Temi, and today we're diving into one of the highly misunderstood and quite important meetings in the Agile framework or Agile methods. We're looking at the backlog refinement meetings. Yes, backlog refinement. Now, it is one of the most crucial yet often misunderstood agile events. It ensures that your backlog items are well defined, properly estimated, and ready for upcoming sprints. But there's a catch. You see, teams often go into these rabbit holes, or we say common pitfalls and misconceptions that make this event ineffective. So, do you know what we're going to do today? We're going to explore what makes a great backlog refinement session. We're going to debunk a couple of myths and discuss 5 pitfalls to avoid. So let's get started. So welcome again to the Agile Matrix Podcast with Temi. Okay, so number 1, let's define backlog refinement. Now, backlog refinement is an ongoing process where the team, that is the Scrum team, reviews, discusses, and clarifies backlog items. So this could include breaking down large user stories into smaller actionable ones. You know, like sometimes you might have a situation where the user story is an idea that the product owner or a member of among the developers has put together to say, I'm thinking we can do A. It's a rough idea. So in the refinement session, we break these kind of ideas down also into actionable, smaller ideas, right? During the refinement, we also clarify the acceptance criteria. We remove or we reprioritize outdated tasks. And then if you do estimation at all, I wonder why, but if you do, at this point, we usually would estimate either via story points or t-shirt sizing, right? So now, if you study the Scrum guide properly, you don't see backlog refinement as a separate event. It is what we call a complementary practice or event. In other words, it helps, but it's not part of the original Scrum guide, right? So it's an essential practice that helps teams avoid last minute chaos during sprint planning. And like I always say to people, if you have backlog refinement that is done proper, it makes sprint planning very livable. Why? Because you've done a lot of the heavy lifting in the refinement. The team understands the story, they understand the ask, the assessment criteria is there, it's been most likely pointed. And like I said, the team understand what the story is about. So when they go into sprint planning, it's a lot easier. Now, if you're thinking about sprint planning, try to understand what it is. There's a episode that I have a couple of months ago about sprint planning. So you can go listen to that or watch it. But let's go on. So now, before we go into the common pitfalls, let's address 2 big myths about backlog refinement that often lead teams in the wrong direction. So number 1, backlog refinement is only for the product owner. Interesting. Now, many teams think that the backlog refinement is just the product owner's responsibility and the team doesn't need to be involved. That is the myth. They assume, like I've seen situations where the product owner is meant to sit down and break down the story enough for the team. So it's like a user story factory that then produces for the team. The actual truth is, while the product owner plays a key role in prioritizing and defining product backlog items, backlog refinement is a team effort. The developers, the testers, the designers, the analysts, they all need to contribute to ensure user stories are clear, technically feasible, and properly estimated if you do, right? So that's myth number 1 debunked. It is a team sport. It actually is a working session where the team break down the stories, refine the stories. If you do estimation, estimate the stories, but make it clear what the ask is. So that's myth number 1 debunked. Now, myth number 2, backlog refinement will result in fully detailed requirements. Yes. Now, what are we saying? Some teams, some organizations, some Scrum Masters, some developers believe that the backlog refinement means fully defining every single detail of a story before it enters a sprint. That is wrong. That is false. The actual truth is, like we say, agility equals adaptability, right? A product backlog item should be refined enough for the team to start working on it. But this refinement requirement should be so rigid that there isn't room for learning or iteration. So what are we saying? The refinement should focus on clarity, not excessive documentation. In other words, are we comfortable enough with the story to then work on it when the sprint starts? That is a requirement. Not that we know every single detail about the story. It would take too long, right? It would take too long. So the idea is, are we comfortable enough with the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns to go with this story into the next sprint, right? So those are the two myths debunked, right? So what are we saying? Let's look at what happens in a well-run backlog refinement session, right? We're looking at a couple of things that should be in it. Number one, it should be collaborative. The whole team should contribute, not just the product owner. Number two, it should be time boxed. Now, what do we always say? We say typically a team should spend maybe about 5 to 10% of their sprint time refining the backlog, right? Then also there should be focus on readiness. The goal is to have backlog items in a ready state for sprint planning. Now, I know some of us use what we call the definition of ready. Now, I've said many times that when you're doing definition of ready, you have to be careful that it's not a stage gate. So when we say definition of ready, a user story is a promise of an ongoing conversation. So when you say definition of ready, what you should actually be looking at, have we considered these things? It's not that we must answer everything, but is this in the consideration for the conversation? Do you get? So it's not a stage gate. It's more of being aware of certain things that we require for this story to be picked up, right? Okay. Anyway, so I've said focus on readiness. Now, the fourth one, it should be prioritized. The most important and valuable items should be discussed first. Your backlog must be an ordered backlog. So you discuss the most important and valuable items first in refinement. Then it must be well facilitated. So if it's a scrum master, the product owner, or a member of the team that's facilitating, they should ensure that the conversation stays productive. The every event or session that we have in Scrum, you have to ensure it is effective, right? It meets its objective and it sticks within its time box. All right? Okay, so that's those five things. Now let's look at five common pitfalls regarding backlog refinement and how to avoid them. So number one, turning the backlog refinement into a second sprint planning meeting. Right? Now, some teams treat their backlog refinement meeting like a full-fledged sprint planning session, discussing every ticket to the nth detail instead of focusing on high-level readiness. Now, how do you solve this? Because it's very easy to jump into this rabbit hole. First thing that you do, keep the discussion high level. Ask, is this story clear enough for sprint planning? If yes, move on. If not, refine further. But don't start planning tasks. Don't break down the story into subtasks and tasks. No. It's a high level breakdown on the stories, with the requirement being, is the story clear enough for us to take it into sprint planning? Are we comfortable with what we know so far to move on with the story? If not, refine further to get to that level of comfort. That is pitfall number one. So it is not a second sprint planning event. Then pitfall number two, refining too many or too few stories. Now, some teams spend a lot of time refining so many stories, right? They waste time on these stories that will be worked on for months. Often refine others rather will refine too little, leading to poorly prepared sprints. Remember what I said about the refinement session, making your sprint planning livable. So if you refine too little, you're going to go into sprint planning to refine some more. But if you refine too much, you remember we're in an agile environment, complex. So we're looking at just in time. So the plan is to refine just what you need for the next sprint. There's no point refining for 5 sprints ahead. Waste of effort, waste of time. Things could have changed. You might actually have to pivot from those stories, so you wasted effort refining what you're not going to work on. That is the idea. So what are we saying? Use just enough or just in time principle. Only refine the top priority items for the next sprint or at the max, the other sprint. So you are refining stories for 1 sprint or 2 sprints at the very maximum. That is how you solve that pitfall. So do not refine too many or too few. So pitfall number 3, lack of team engagement. What are we saying? Sometimes only the product owner and Scrum Master are there discussing the stories or actively contributing to refinements. The developers, the analysts, the testers just stay in silence and watch like it's a movie. Now that's not good, right? So what do? You encourage active participation by asking open-ended questions. Use techniques like planning, poker, and the rest to engage the team in estimation. Bring them into the meeting. Why? Because they are meant to refine. Remember, the sprint is theirs. So they are refining stories ready for the next sprint or two. So they have to be involved for it to work, right? Then pitfall number 4, ignoring technical considerations. Now, look at it this way. There's the business requirements, there's technical consideration. This is an aspiration. This proves whether or not it is possible. Now, if you ignore the technical considerations, you have basically thought experiments. You have unrealistic sprint commitments because you haven't considered what it takes to actually deliver it, make it real, right? So what do? Ensure your developers weigh in on technical feasibility, dependencies, and risks. Use lightly, correctly, definition of ready to align expectations. It has to be good as per business and good as per technical. It has to be possible. You can't say you want to do this, but actually technically it's going to take several months to do. That is too big a story to actually take into the sprint. So they have to have the two considerations. Then the final pitfall, no clear acceptance criteria. Now, stories without a clear acceptance criteria lead to confusion, there's scope creep, and then also incomplete work and rework, right? So what are we saying? Always ensure you define the acceptance criteria during the refinement. In other words, what does good look like? When this story is completed, what would the outcome look like? That has to be clear. So like I always say, or rather, let me add this. So if you want to test this, ask this question. Will two different developers interpret this story the same way? If not, refine further. You get that? So now, backlog refinement is a powerful tool when done right. It keeps your backlog healthy, it reduces last minute surprises, and makes sprint planning livable. It makes it smoother, right? So just to remember, we've debunked 2 major myths. We've covered 5 pitfalls, right? So if your backlog refinement sessions aren't working, just take a step back and ask, are we truly prepared for success? Or are we just doing it because it's on the calendar? Are we just going through the motions? That's a good question to ask. If you believe that you actually are planning for success or preparing for success, then do these steps. Take these steps I've asked you to take, and then you see your backlog refinement improve in its quality, and you see its impact on your sprint planning, right? And if you are a Scrum Master, ensure that when you are facilitating these events, use the trips and the tips that we're giving you. Ensure that you are focused on the output of the event, you time box, and you encourage everybody to be involved in the conversations, right? So anyway, that is it for today's episode of the Agile Matrix Podcast. If you found this information valuable, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your friends in the Agile community, even your teammates. Also, I would love to hear from you and how you handle your backlog refinement. So connect with me on LinkedIn, on Instagram, even on Spotify and anywhere you listen to this podcast. Let me know how you handle your backlog refinement. So until next time, stay agile and stay doing great stuff. Have a fantastic day. This is greetings from Temi on the Agile Matrix Podcast. Cheers, everyone.